Hello, this is Branko Malic, Kali Tribune. In this video, we'll focus on the problem of abortion or infanticide. Now, this "or" word has a significance for us here, and I think you'll soon discover why. Now, the motive for doing this video, that is to say what provoked it, is something that happened in USA recently at the end of the last month, beginning this month, and this is something that caused a lot of fuss in media. This was the overturning of the proposed bill for so-called late-term abortion, where the idea was that the rules for performing abortions in late pregnancy, or even what ended up meaning after delivery, would be legal in some way. And Virginia Governor Ralph Northam was talking about defending this bill, and there's something he said that caused a lot of stir, and this is the where we'll kick off. Although this is not the real what this man thinks, and how people react to his words is not the main subject of this video, but this is what kicks us into gear. So let's read his statement given to one American radio station. He says, "When we talk about third trimester abortions, these are done, of course, abortions in the very late stage of pregnancy. These are done with the consent of, obviously, the mother, with the consent of the physicians, more than one physician, by the way, and it's done in cases where there may be severe deformities, there may be a fetus that's not non-viable. So in this particular example, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered, the infant would be kept comfortable, the infant, note mother-infant, not mother-child, this is very important. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. So I think this was really blown out of proportions." So with this, he caused a lot of stir, and people with full right got the impression that he's cautioning in words what amounts to infanticide. That is to say, let us differentiate open infanticide. Whereas, for the sake of argument, we'll take a position that abortion is not an open infanticide. But does it mean that it is not infanticide? That's something we'll still have to decide in the course of this video. Now, in New York, a similar law recently have passed. We won't go too deep into it, just to point out the governor, Cuomo, governor of New York. I'm not American. Shut up, lady. I don't want to bash Americans about what happens in their country, but this is something that concerns us all, because in the first instance, it gives us a good bird's view on the problematics of abortion and or infanticide, and what happens in US tends to spread all around the world. Although I would like to point out in advance something about America and America bashing. In USA, it is far harder to some extent to pass these kinds of measures. Whereas because of the people's resistance, America is, as I understand, somewhere around 50-50 on these, public opinion about these matters. Whereas you have countries like Ireland in Europe that I would maliciously assume push this kind of legislation via referendum. I can't say this 100%, but I think that this is the trajectory, and if somebody would push infanticide cushioned in nice words in Ireland or referendum, I think it would pass with just a bit of public relations strategizing. So let us not, this is not about bashing Americans, that's just what I wanted to point out. Mainly because bashing Americans is very cheap and boring. Now, the main problem, the thing that ruffled the feathers, so to speak, is that this guy is cushioning, advocating infanticide. For some reason, he, I think, claims that he is not, but this is completely obvious. This is elementary logic, and there is no other logic than elementary logic. He is telling us about the infant that will be kept comfortable and killed or left to die. This is this ancient method of killing unwanted children. You just leave them to die or leave them for wild animals to have them for lunch. This is what this man is advocating, and this is what this amendment of law is obviously all about. Now, we on Kali Tribune stand on assumption that there is nothing overtly dramatic about this, that this is what abortus or abortion is all about in the first place. And to argue our point, we'll employ help from the advocates, open advocates of infanticide, that were not trying to cushion their words in any kind of flowery terminology, but called it what it is: killing a newborn. Now, Alberto Giubilini, Francesca Minerva are two Italian authors. They call themselves philosophers on the grounds of which are not clear to me at all, and we already talked about them. Didre and me, our friend Didre from Ireland, we had a podcast discussing the article. We'll analyze now a bit, not all, because we analyzed it in this podcast, and I do recommend you give it a listen. It covers a lot of subjects, not only the subject of post-birth abortion or of infanticide, and I think it was really good. One of the best I had, if not the best I had, podcast I had with somebody since I'm running Kali Tribune. Now, we'll read an abstract. It is, for those who don't know, this is the obligatory summing up of scientific article. Because this article is considered scientific, it was peer-reviewed. Abortion is largely accepted, even for reasons that do not have anything to do with the fetus' health. By showing that both fetuses and newborns do not have the same moral status as actual persons, the fact that both are potential persons is morally irrelevant, and adoption is not always in the best interest of actual people, the authors argue that what we call afterbirth abortion, in brackets killing a newborn, should be permissible in all the cases where abortion is, including cases where the newborn is not disabled. Now, just to say in advance, these two freaks, in my opinion, probably wanted to exercise some shock effect. That's why they are so unabashed in their statements. So there is that. But as this is argued article, it is not well argued, but it is argued and consequent. To some extent, they are really advocating for a position that is considered viable in academia for a long time. In this podcast I just mentioned, you can hear a lot more about this. I won't go into it, just to point out what they are saying here. They argue that between fetus and newborn, at a certain age, until the certain age, there is no reason, there is no substantial difference. Because they are, as they say, potential persons, and potential persons are morally relevant. And adoption is not always in the best interest of actual people. And for this reason, they argue that killing a newborn, and we won't call it after-birth abortion, it's a stupid term, we call it killing a newborn, killing a child, not killing an infant. Killing a newborn should be permissible in all the cases where abortion is. I would argue that this is quite consequent conclusion. It's quite consequent conclusion because it takes into account premises that are used to define what the abortion is. And abortion is very rarely defined. There are legal definitions, there are political definitions, but are they the definitions of the act itself? Now, this act is the termination of life. And the argument is to argue that termination of life is morally permissible, in some cases even good, is that this life does not possess personhood. This is the main argument. And everything relies on how the personhood is defined. Well, the personhood in this article is defined as ability to have a rational self-conscious, whatever they mean by it. The rational self-conscious for these people is the ability of biological organism to construct its purpose, save for its biological purposes. This is the ability to be grown-up, liberal human being. Now, I'm not being ironic here. This is the human being that is defined by its rational self-interest. This is the foundation of personhood, and this rational self-interest, or even emotional self-interest as they see it in some animals, is sacrosanct as opposed to something that we for millennia until maybe sexual revolution used to call human nature. Now, abortion was shunned, especially in Christian civilization, in which we still live, by the fact that destroying a human being is destroying of the expression of human nature, that being human is good in itself, and any kind of preventing full development of this nature in its full natural form is a crime, and to some extent maybe even greater crime, the downright murder. It is my contention that these two authors are in fact right. Right in the sense that their premises do end up in their conclusions, that the fact that those premises are insane and that conclusion is genocidal is a completely different issue. We'll try to stick to logic here and not to sentiments or to the emotions. We'll keep them for other purposes. Now, there is something about abortion and euthanasia, for instance, and such practices, and even gay marriages, and they go together, in my opinion, but we won't go into that now, that people call slippery slope. Namely, slippery slope is the situation in which we, for society, enacts a law, for instance, law that legalizes assisted suicide, which is euthanasia. That is to say that institutions can assist you in your suicide, and that they are not only can, that they are in the end obliged to assist you. Now, the slippery slope argument goes like this. Well, if this is if criteria for assisted suicide is the best interest of the man or woman who wants to be euthanized or mercy killed, where do we stop? For instance, what about children that are suffering and cannot communicate their self-interest and so on and so forth? And lo and behold, in Netherlands, they came up with so-called Groningen Protocol in 2002-2003, which lays out principles for euthanizing a child without child's consent, because child cannot give consent, of course. And this is makes it perfectly legal. The other possible slippery slope, so-called slippery slope, is that once you have euthanasia institutionalized, who's to stop boards of lawyers or all kind of government officials deciding that your qualities of life is bad and that you should be euthanized, maybe. Decide this for you. There is no, as people say, there is no inherent logical obstacle to coming to these conclusions. And this is slippery slope. And this is also in abortion. The slippery slope of abortion was, well, if we don't give a right definition, don't forbid abortion except in special cases or something like that, there'll be somebody one day who will say that even the newborn child, so-called infant, as a friend Norton would call it, as opposed to mother, not parent but mother. So it is not, what he wants to say is, of course, that child is not human. This is what he is implying. He's downplaying the humanness of child, calling an infant, while mother is humanized by being mother, because it is all supposedly for the sake of mother. Anyway, I digress. The idea is that this will lead to precisely this kind of slippery slope, that abortion leads into this. Well, it is the thesis here on how I will propose a conclusion, in fact, not a thesis, of this whole situation, interpretation of this situation, that slippery slope is not a slippery slope. Slippery slope is the process of explicatio, as they would call it in the Middle Ages, that is to say, explication of what the given subject is. I.e., it is the definition, it is the determination of the scope of the being in question, of the thing in question. Thing in question is abortion. So what we call slippery slope is a terminus. It's the furthest limit of definition of abortion. And as such, abortion has to reach its furthest limits, so we could see what it is. So it could be what it is. It could be completely actualized act. And slippery slope, and same goes, in my opinion, for euthanasia. Slippery slope is not, in effect, slippery slope. It's an inherent logic of abortion that has nowhere to end but in infanticide, or, as these authors succinctly put it, killing a newborn. This is something that we today don't see at the first instance, because I would say that things like abortion, these social changes are always implemented step by step and over a historically relatively, not relatively, but very short period of time, but period of time in which social change is constantly accelerated, so that every new generation loses, we are talking about very small number of generations from where the abortion became viable to discuss even in respectful society, until the moment in the 60s where with sexual evolution it became a subject that can and should be supposedly openly discussed. Now that we are in a situation where discussing against it is something that is not accepted in so-called polite society, respectable society. And this is a span of 100 years at the most. And this is a very short historical period. And this period is what, to some extent, coincides with the experiment of late modernity, of creating the modern and, in the later part, postmodern societies that are built not on any traditional principles. Traditional principles means principles that are transferred, accepted mainly because they are transferred from the previous age. Not uncritically, but this transference is very important. I would argue that modernity in this radical sense means enmity against all the principles that are tradere, that are transferred from previous ages, because this is the only way it can function as a radical modernity, that is a radical attempt at a radical permanent revolutionary change, a freedom of radical social change. And that now, at our day and age, I think slowly not slowly, as ever more faster sinks into complete chaos. There is something in logic we call supposition of termins, suppositio terminorum. It's not, as one would think, supposition as hypothesis. No, suppositio means the thing or the nature reflected in concept. This is not a reference in the sense, for instance, when I say Kali Tribune, and then this is my notion, word that has signifies some notion, and this notion in turn signify a certain website. No. This is the modern ontology, modern logic, where you presuppose that you construct concepts, words, and so on, and then consequently those words are kind of like, and notions are put like labels on things that are quote unquote outside us. In suppositio, we are talking about nature. That is to say, nature of a thing we defined, and scope that this nature encompasses, when it is completely explicated, that is to say, analyzed. Because analysis in this traditional logic is a process of explication, of laying out possibilities contained in a thing or phenomena. We would call it thing. Phenomena is not a good expression, it's subjectivist. And this is not analysis in the modern sense. This is the direct translation of the word analysis to anti. From Greek, and it meant precisely this for Greeks too. But in the modern philosophy, modern kind of thinking, of which these two authors, Giubellini, Minerva, are very potent representatives, the things are quite different. Analysis means cutting up things to elements that are considered like atoms. Bertrand Russell had the idea of logical facts, whatever the hell that those logical facts are. I guess seen through logical microscope, and this has nothing to do with what analysis originally is, because our analysis is not a destructive process. It's not a process of taking thing apart, but explicating what a thing is. And I would say that this suppositio of abortion is infanticide. In fact. Now, if you consider that abortion, that the main reason for abortion is the decision of, as these authors call, actual person about her life, not to be impeded by the burden of a child, then there is absolutely no difference about between abortion and infanticide for these reasons. They are talking about children with Down syndrome. Once these children are born, I quote, there is no choice for the parents but to keep the child, which sometimes is exactly what they would not have done if the disease has been diagnosed before birth. End quote. Now, what they want to say here is that there are times when you can't diagnose Down syndrome in the womb. So why prevent parents who don't want child with Down syndrome from getting rid of it? Simply, they propose kill it, off it, snuff it, because supposedly it won't feel pain, or you'll find a way for it not to feel pain and put it out of its misery and let parents go their way. Now, this is one side of argument, and I think they are very consequent here. I think this is true. The other side is that abortion is different in the sense that really it is not a murder, but this also takes us back to the position that potential, what they call potential person, this is arbitrary definition. This is an undeveloped body of human, undeveloped, not terminally developed human being. And they argue that as such it can be oft because personhood and humaneness, what makes human is something that comes through evolution, biological evolution. Now, interesting thing is, as a traditional thinkers thought about gestation, there were passages that will write about this on Kali Tribune. I'll just mention it here. And one medieval thinker, when he says that gestation, pregnancy, is a recreation of the world in the sense because in human, all strata of being are expressed from the mineral to vegetable, animal, and finally intellectual soul. Everything in these 9 months, everything becomes actual through a gradual, continuous process. In a Christian sense, and this would be painting an imago viva Dei, the image of the living God. This would be the act of painting this image. And I think I don't have to point out what violent prevention of this painting would mean in Christian sense. But to get back to arguments, modern arguments, far weaker arguments, I would say. This is the ultimately this position of pro-infanticide or child killing advocates. Their attitude is very consequent in the sense that they just reject human nature. My contention is that most of the opposition towards abortion is built also on those what I call liberal arguments of the right shoes. I think those arguments are not good because they end up also in this. These people logically win because they chose the ground to do battle, and on this ground that is their conceptual system, which exists only in their heads, is the only one possible. And you can find some nooks and crannies where you can put an argument against abortion, but ultimately it all ends up into a fact that newborn child is not a morally irrelevant subject. It's not something you should preserve. It's irrelevant. The thing is then that from this point on, it just doesn't matter if this child is a fetus or if it is newborn, because both fetus and newborn don't show any signs of what a modern liberal emancipated human being would call human being, that is his own fucking reflection. And in this sense, I think that in abortus and infanticide are now starting to converge on each other. That we see that really infanticide is not a product of slippery slope, but a logical explication of what abortion is. Although it took some time, but it didn't take too much time. It took in USA. We are now talking about USA. I don't know how many. When was a Roe versus Wade famous case when ban of abortion was lifted, first in Texas, then other places. I think in 1973. That's rather recent thing, and I'm constantly referring to this. What is recent? What is historically not long in existence, and so on, because we are witnessing probably the results of this postmodern experiment that was historically very short, and we don't see how this yet in what these results will resolve themselves. It won't be good as much as I see. Only good thing would be to discard. Seems to be to discard completely this project. What to put instead of it, we won't go into that, but the thing is that it is going into very dark direction. It is already there in a lot of places in the world, and we'll see. The point is that this is we are having a debate about something that is historically very recent, and that the brainwashing of generations is a brainwashing of, I would say, 2 to 3, maybe 4 generations. This is not very long, and it's a gradual process. So there are still people who intuitively see that something's wrong with it, but it is there is a gap between seeing something is wrong and explaining why it is wrong. So this is, but not to say that this what happens in America is a landmark case. Just to say that it is a logical consequence, that suppositio of abortion is killing of a child, and that it will be demonstrated as such in reality, not in somebody like me helping it by talking and defining concepts, analyzing concepts, but that it will be institutionalized in the widest scope in the Western world, and that people will have to, in a very near future, decide where they stand on these things. And but decide not in the sense of not being sure, because abortion is very difficult thing, because we are talking about a preventive murder. In fact, this is something that is very hard to define, to pinpoint. This is, and for these reasons, people tend to be undecided. But I think now that its murderous nature will explicate itself, and people will be able to give it consent or reject it. And I think the people who will consent to it and celebrate it will celebrate it in a fashion that will not hide any gruesome aspect of it. They will celebrate gruesomeness in a terms that will probably keep them believing in their own goodness, I will propose one of those terms, one of those things or values that will keep those people from breaking the mirrors they're looking into with their heads, disgusted at their own snouts, reflections of their own snouts. That would be, for instance, love for animals or fluffy little animals and such things. With there will be probably buzzwords like slurs like love has won, as they do in this transgender mainstreaming and so on and so forth. To conclude, I do believe that this will come to a crisis, that is to say, to a judgment, to making to people being in position to really see without any shadow of a doubt what they advocate when they advocate for abortion, and consequently they'll have to bear the full consequences, because they won't be able to say anymore that they were fooled into something. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.